Jerome was once a booming copper mining town, built on the blood, sweat, and tragedy of thousands who came seeking fortune. But as the mines closed and the population dwindled, Jerome became a place where the dead never left, with over 100 reported hauntings and a reputation as one of America's most haunted towns. Jerome's history is steeped in violence, loss, and the supernatural. From abandoned hospitals to forgotten tunnels, every corner of this ghost town holds a story of terror waiting to be told. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened in Jerome, Arizona. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or supernatural bullshit. I wasn't then, and honestly, even after everything, part of me still wants to rationalize what I experienced down in that mine, but I can't. And if you're sitting there thinking you'd handle it differently, that you'd be smarter or braver, you're wrong. Because when you're a mile underground and something that shouldn't exist starts breathing in perfect rhythm with your own lungs, all that confidence evaporates faster than water on hot asphalt. 3 months ago, I ran a YouTube channel dedicated to urban exploration. Had about 40,000 subscribers who loved watching me crawl through abandoned hospitals, climb rusted water towers, that sort of thing. I was always careful, always did my research, and I never went anywhere actually dangerous. The algorithm loved my content because I delivered consistent uploads with decent production value and just enough risk to keep people engaged. When I started planning a Southwest exploration series, Jerome kept coming up in my research. The ghost town angle, the mining history, the fact that it's literally sliding down a mountain. It was perfect content. So I loaded up my gear, drove 10 hours from Los Angeles, and arrived in Jerome on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when the desert sun made the abandoned buildings shimmer like mirages. I spent the first day establishing shots of the town, talking to locals at the coffee shops, playing the role of the enthusiastic content creator. Everyone had a story about Jerome's hauntings, but they all felt rehearsed, like they'd told these tales to 1,000 tourists before me. One old man, sitting outside the sliding jail, warned me specifically about the United Verde Mine, said people went down there and came back different, if they came back at all. I smiled and nodded and thanked him for the warning, already planning how I'd edit his words into my intro. That night, I scouted the mine entrance I'd found on some old mining maps, a ventilation shaft about 2 miles outside town that looked accessible and hadn't been sealed with concrete like most of the others. The chain-link fence had a gap just wide enough to squeeze through, and when I shined my flashlight down into the darkness, I could see the iron rungs of a ladder descending into the mountain. Perfect. I came back the next morning with my full kit, GoPro mounted on my helmet, backup flashlights, rope, first aid supplies, protein bars, water, and my phone fully charged even though I knew there wouldn't be signal down there. The air coming up from the shaft smelled like copper and stone and something organic that had been rotting for decades. I should have recognized that smell as a warning, but instead I was thinking about camera angles and how my subscribers would react to genuine mine exploration footage. I clipped my safety rope to a support beam, tested my helmet cam, and started my descent. The ladder rungs were slick with some kind of moisture that made my hands slide, and more than once I had to stop and wipe my palms on my jeans. As I climbed down, the circle of daylight above me got smaller and smaller until it was just a distant point of white against absolute darkness. When my feet finally touched solid ground, I was standing in a horizontal shaft that stretched in both directions beyond the reach of my flashlight. The walls were dark red rock, and you could see where the drilling had left spiral patterns from some machine that had carved through here 100 years ago. Wooden support beams overhead were black with age and weeping something that looked like tar. I turned on my secondary lights and started walking, narrating for the camera about the history of copper mining, the conditions the workers endured, all the standard urban exploration commentary. My voice echoed strangely in the tunnel, like it was traveling farther than it should, and coming back changed somehow. After about 50 feet, I noticed something that made me stop talking mid-sentence. I could hear breathing, not my own breathing, which was coming in steady, controlled breaths, the way I'd trained myself for these expeditions. This was different. It was synchronized perfectly with mine, inhaling exactly when I inhaled, exhaling when I exhaled. But it was coming from somewhere ahead in the darkness. I told myself it was just echo, just the acoustics of the tunnel playing tricks. I kept walking, kept filming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the breathing was getting closer, even though I was the one moving. The tunnel started to branch, side passages opening up that hadn't been on any of the maps I'd studied. I marked my path with chalk X's on the walls, basic exploration protocol, and chose the main shaft that looked most traveled. That's when I noticed the temperature. It was dropping fast, going from the ambient cave cool to something that made my breath visible in clouds. In August, in Arizona. At the same time, I started seeing things at the edge of my light, movement just for a second, like someone was walking parallel to me in the side tunnels. I'd spin to look, and there'd be nothing, just empty passages and more of those weeping support beams. The breathing never stopped. It followed me through every turn, matched every change in my pace. When I held my breath to test if it was really there, the other breathing continued for exactly 3 seconds before stopping too, like whatever was making the sound needed a moment to realize I'd changed. That's when my chest got tight with the first real threat of fear. I decided to head back. Told myself I had enough footage anyway, but when I turned around, the tunnel looked different. The chalk marks I'd made were gone, not smudged or faded, completely absent, like I'd never marked the walls at all. The side passages I'd walked past were in different positions, opening on the wrong sides of the main shaft. I pulled out my phone to check the compass app, knowing it was stupid because compasses don't work reliably underground near copper deposits, and the screen showed me something impossible. According to my GPS, which somehow still had a signal, I was 3 miles deeper into the mountain than I'd actually walked. That's when I started moving faster, trying to retrace my steps by memory, but the tunnels kept changing. I'd walk down a passage that dead-ended at a cave-in, backtrack, and find that the tunnel I'd just used was now blocked by a wall of stone that looked like it had been there for centuries. The breathing was louder now, and I could tell it wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was surrounding me, echoing from every side passage, and from above and below, dozens of sets of lungs, all synchronized with mine. I was trying not to panic, trying to think logically, but logic doesn't apply when the physical space you're in is actively reconfiguring itself. I found myself in a chamber I definitely hadn't seen before, roughly circular with 7 tunnels branching off like spokes on a wheel. In the center was a pile of mining equipment from different eras. Pickaxes from the 1800s next to pneumatic drills from the 1940s, all of it arranged in a careful stack like someone had been collecting it. Next to the equipment pile was something that made my stomach drop. A rope. Just like mine, same bright orange color, same diameter, hanging from a hole in the ceiling about 20 feet up. I looked up and could see daylight. Not the ventilation shaft I'd entered through. This was different. The opening was wider, and the light had that late afternoon quality, even though it should still be mid-morning. But it was a way out. I didn't question it. I just grabbed that rope and started climbing, hand over hand, ignoring the burning in my arms and the way the breathing below me suddenly changed. It wasn't matching my rhythm anymore. It was getting faster, agitated, like whatever owned those lungs was angry that I was leaving. I climbed faster, not looking down, and when my hand finally gripped the edge of the opening and I pulled myself out into sunlight, I just lay there, on solid ground, gasping. Except I wasn't where I should be. I was on the side of the mountain, at least a quarter mile from where I'd entered, and the sun was setting. My phone said it was 7 in the evening. I'd been down there for 9 hours, even though it had felt like maybe 90 minutes. When I checked my GoPro footage later, back in my motel room, with the lights on and the door locked, it showed me climbing down the ladder, walking through the tunnels, talking to my camera. but there was something else in every frame. In the darkness behind me, barely visible, even when I enhanced the footage, were figures. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all standing perfectly still and watching me walk past. And in every single shot, even the ones where I was supposedly alone in empty tunnels, you could see their chests moving, breathing, all of them, in perfect unison with me. I left Jerome that night. Didn't pack properly, didn't say goodbye to anyone, just threw everything in my car and drove. I deleted the footage. Shut down my channel. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was carbon monoxide hallucinations or dehydration or some rational explanation. But 3 weeks later, I woke up in my apartment in Los Angeles and heard it. That same breathing, synchronized with mine, coming from inside my closet. I've moved twice since then. Changed apartments, changed cities. It doesn't matter. Every night, in the darkness, I hear it. The breathing. And I know what it means now. I know what those miners found down there, in the deepest shafts, what Jerome is really built on top of. They didn't abandon those mines because the copper ran out. They sealed them because something down there was learning how we move, how we breathe, how we exist, and every person who goes down there teaches it a little more. I taught it my rhythm, and now it won't let me go. Listen, I need to tell you about something that happened to me last month at the Jerome Grand Hotel, and I need you to understand that I'm not the type of person who gets rattled easily. I've spent 5 years building a travel blog, debunking haunted locations, exposing camera tricks and creaky floorboards, and the psychological reasons people convince themselves they've seen ghosts. I've slept in supposedly cursed castles in Scotland, spent nights in asylums where people swore they heard screaming, walked through catacombs in Paris that locals refused to enter after dark. Every single time, I walked out with logical explanations and footage proving there was nothing supernatural happening. Every single time, until Jerome. Until room 32. Until I watched myself do things I have absolutely no memory of doing. And I had to confront the possibility that sometimes the rational explanation is the most terrifying one of all. The Jerome Grand Hotel sits at the highest point in town, 5,000 feet above sea level. This massive white structure that used to be the United Verde Hospital back in the 20s. It closed as a hospital in 1950 after treating generations of miners for silicosis, mercury poisoning, cave-in injuries, every gruesome way the mountain could destroy a human body. The building sat abandoned for decades before someone converted it into a hotel, and naturally, every paranormal enthusiast claimed it was haunted. Room 32 supposedly had the most activity. A nurse who killed herself, a patient who died during surgery, the usual ghost story catalog you hear at every historic hotel trying to drum up tourist business. I booked 3 nights specifically because the reviews were so dramatic. People claimed objects moved on their own. Shadows appeared in photographs. They felt hands touching them in the darkness. Perfect content for my blog. I document everything, explain the rational causes, prove once again that haunted hotels are just old buildings with good marketing. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the Arizona sun made the whole town shimmer like something not quite real. The hotel lobby still had original Art Deco fixtures from when it was a hospital, beautiful geometric patterns in brass and frosted glass that caught the light in strange ways. The woman at the front desk smiled when I said I was checking into room 32, that knowing smile people give when they think you're about to get exactly what you're asking for. She handed me an old-fashioned metal key and said the elevator could be temperamental, sometimes stopped at floors that didn't exist anymore. I laughed and told her I'd take the stairs. When I got to the 3rd floor, the hallway smelled like antiseptic and something floral that had been trying to cover up the antiseptic smell for about 80 years. Room 32 was at the end, facing the valley below, where you could see straight down 2,000 feet of nothing but air and history. The room itself was exactly what I expected. Period furniture trying too hard to be authentic. A bed with a brass frame. Windows that didn't quite fit their frames anymore, so you could feel the mountain wind sliding through the gaps. I set up my equipment immediately, the same setup I'd used in dozens of locations. Motion-activated cameras in each corner, audio recorders with timestamp capabilities, EMF readers that would document any electromagnetic fluctuations, and most importantly, my phone mounted on a tripod streaming live to my blog. 24-hour coverage, every moment documented, impossible to fake. I went live at 6 p.m. talking to my followers about what I was doing, explaining the history of the building, promising them I'd stay awake as long as possible to catch any supposed paranormal activity. The comments rolled in with the usual mix of believers, hoping I'd finally encounter something real, and skeptics cheering me on for exposing another fraud. The first weird thing happened around 11 p.m. I was sitting on the bed reviewing footage from my earlier walk around the hotel when the elevator dinged in the hallway. Not unusual, except the front desk had told me I was the only guest on the third floor that night. Midweek in October wasn't exactly peak tourist season. I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. I checked my phone stream, still broadcasting, still recording, my followers seeing exactly what I was seeing. I waited for a knock that never came. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps retreated and the elevator dinged again. I opened my door to an empty hallway, punched the elevator button, and watched the old brass needle above the door indicate the car was descending. When it reached the ground floor, it stopped. I documented everything for the camera, explaining how old hotel buildings settle, how pipes and ventilation systems create sounds that seem like footsteps, how the mind interprets random noise as patterns. My followers ate it up. Around 1 a.m., sitting in the chair by the window because the bed seemed too vulnerable somehow, I started noticing the shadows in the room weren't behaving right. The moonlight coming through those gaps in the window frames should have been creating consistent shadow patterns, but they kept shifting when nothing was moving. I'd look directly at a shadow, and it would be still. Look away and catch movement in my peripheral vision. Classic peripheral vision distortion, I explained to the camera, caused by the rods in your eyes being more sensitive to motion than the cones that handle direct focus. But my EMF readers were spiking, jumping from baseline to numbers that suggested massive electromagnetic interference, the kind you get standing directly under power lines. Except we were on the third floor of a hotel on a mountain with no significant electrical infrastructure nearby. I documented the readings, noted them for later analysis, and told myself there had to be a rational explanation involving the building's wiring or some geological feature of the mountain that concentrated natural electromagnetic fields. At 2:30 a.m., I watched the brass bed frame start to tarnish in real time. I'm talking about metal that had been polished to a mirror shine when I checked in, suddenly developing this black oxidation that spread like ink in water, crawling across the surface in patterns that looked almost deliberate. I got close-up footage, made sure the timestamp was visible, checked that my live stream was still broadcasting. My followers were going insane in the comments, some screaming that I needed to leave immediately, others accusing me of using some kind of chemical treatment to fake the effect. But I hadn't touched the bed frame. I'd barely touched anything in the room. I explained to the camera that rapid oxidation could occur due to humidity and temperature changes, that old brass was particularly susceptible, that what looked supernatural was probably just chemistry happening faster than we usually observe it. Even as I said it, I didn't quite believe myself because the patterns were too precise, too intentional, spelling out something that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. I was still filming the bed frame when I heard my own voice behind me. Not an echo, not a recording. My voice, my exact tone and cadence coming from the bathroom. I spun around, and in the mirror above the sink, I could see myself standing in the bathroom looking back at me. Except I wasn't in the bathroom. I was standing in the middle of the room with my phone in my hand. The reflection moved independently, tilting its head like it was studying me, and then it smiled. Not my smile. Something wearing my face incorrectly, like it had learned how smiling worked from a textbook, but didn't quite understand the emotion behind it. I checked my live stream, still broadcasting, still recording everything, and in the frame of my phone camera, I could see myself standing exactly where I was standing. No reflection in the mirror. The bathroom was empty in my phone's view, but when I looked up at the actual mirror with my actual eyes, the other me was still there, still smiling, starting to move in ways bodies don't move, joints bending at angles that would require bones to break. I stopped streaming. First time in 5 years of doing this, I actually ended a broadcast early. Told my followers there was a technical difficulty. I'd post an explanation later. I needed to think. I needed to review the footage I'd captured without an audience watching me have what might have been a psychological break. I downloaded everything from my cameras and recorders, and that's when I found the gap. From 1:45 a.m. to 2:30 a.m., 45 minutes of my life, my live stream showed me sleeping peacefully on the bed, just lying there, not moving, barely breathing, dead to the world. Except I hadn't slept. I remembered every minute of that time. I remembered sitting in the chair watching the shadows, documenting the EMF readings, explaining everything to the camera. But according to every piece of recording equipment I had, I'd been unconscious on that bed. The footage from my corner cameras was worse. They showed me getting up at 1:50 a.m., walking to the corner of the room my phone stream couldn't quite capture, and doing something. The angle wasn't good enough to see exactly what, but I was moving with purpose, my hands working at something, my mouth moving like I was speaking or chanting. This went on for 20 minutes before I returned to the bed and lay back down in the exact position I'd started in. The corner camera footage had audio, and when I played it back with headphones, I could hear my voice. Not English, not any language I'd ever heard. Guttural and rhythmic. The kind of sounds that feel like they're vibrating in your bones more than your ears. And underneath my voice, responding to it, dozens of other voices all whispering in unison, coming from every corner of the room, from the walls themselves, from the mountain the building sat on. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in that chair with every light on, watching the sunrise creep across the Verde Valley below, and I tried to make sense of what had happened. Dissociative episodes, sleepwalking, some kind of carbon monoxide leak causing shared hallucinations between me and my recording equipment. Every rational explanation sounded more insane than just accepting that something impossible had occurred. When the front desk called at 8 a.m. to ask if I wanted to extend my stay, I said no. I'd booked 3 nights, but I was checking out immediately. The woman's voice on the phone had that same knowing quality from when I'd checked in, and she said something that made my skin go cold. She said she hoped I'd gotten the footage I needed, that room 32 always gave people exactly what they were looking for. I packed everything in 15 minutes and loaded my car, but before I left, I did what I always do. I reviewed all my footage one more time to make sure I had everything, to verify the files weren't corrupted, to begin constructing the rational explanation I'd post on my blog. That's when I saw it. In the corner camera footage, in that 20-minute section where I was doing something I couldn't quite see, there was a moment where I turned slightly, and the camera caught my face, and my eyes were wrong. Not the color, not anything obvious, but the way they moved. They tracked things in the room that weren't there, focused on empty air like they were watching something. And the expression on my face was that same broken smile I'd seen in the mirror. Like something was wearing me, learning how I worked, practicing being human. I'm home now, been home for 3 weeks, and I still haven't posted the footage. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know what to do with evidence that I, personally, experienced something that my own equipment contradicts. My followers keep asking what happened to make me cut the stream short, why I haven't updated the blog, if I'm okay. I tell them I'm fine, just dealing with technical issues. I'll post the full explanation soon. But the truth is, I can't stop watching that footage. I can't stop seeing myself do things I don't remember. Can't stop hearing my voice speak languages I don't know. Can't stop wondering what I did in that corner of the room that the camera couldn't quite capture. And every night since I got back, I've been waking up at 1:45 a.m. exactly, and I'll find myself standing in random places in my apartment with no memory of getting out of bed. Yesterday, I woke up standing in my closet facing the wall, and when I turned around, there were symbols drawn on the inside of the closet door in something that looked like ash. The same symbols I'd seen forming in the tarnish on that brass bed frame in room 32. I looked up the history of the Jerome Grand Hospital after I got back, deeper than the ghost stories and tourist information, digging into actual medical records and staff reports from when it was operational. In 1947, there was an incident. A nurse named Catherine Reese, who worked the night shift in the psychiatric ward, started performing unauthorized procedures on comatose patients. She called it consciousness mapping, claimed she'd discovered a way to transfer awareness between bodies, to teach one person's mind how to operate in another person's flesh. The hospital administration found out when a patient woke up speaking in Catherine's voice, using her mannerisms, talking about Catherine's memories. They locked down the ward, but Catherine had already done the procedure on 17 patients. The records describe a week of chaos where patients and staff kept switching, where bodies walked around operated by the wrong minds, where people forgot who they were supposed to be. Catherine disappeared during that week. They found her nurse's uniform in room 32, which was a staff break room at the time, but they never found her. The hospital stopped admitting psychiatric patients after that, and room 32 was sealed until the renovation decades later. I think Catherine's still there. I think she's been practicing for 70 years, perfecting her procedure, learning from everyone who stays in that room. And I think some part of her came back with me. Not all of her. Not enough to take over, but enough to keep trying. Enough to keep testing, keep practicing, keep drawing her symbols, and speaking her languages in the hours I can't account for. I'm documenting everything now, keeping cameras running in my apartment, setting alarms every hour through the night. But I'm starting to lose track of which memories are mine and which ones feel like they belong to someone else. Sometimes I remember being a nurse in a hospital that smelled like copper and antiseptic. Remember desperate miners being carried in from the tunnels. Remember discovering something profound about the nature of consciousness and needing to share it, needing to spread it, needing to teach it to everyone, whether they wanted to learn or not. I'm writing this because I need someone to know what happened before I forget completely. Before Catherine finishes whatever she started that night in room 32. Before I wake up one morning and can't remember my own name because I'm too busy remembering hers. She's patient. She's had decades of practice, and she's figured out how to travel, how to leave that room, how to follow people home and continue her work in private where there are no administrators to stop her, no records to document what she's doing. If you're reading this and you're thinking about visiting Jerome, about staying in the Jerome Grand Hotel, about spending a night in room 32 to see if the stories are true, don't. The stories are true. The room does give you exactly what you're looking for. And what you're looking for is something that's been looking right back, learning your patterns, studying how you move and speak and think, learning how to be you better than you are. And once it figures that out, once it's practiced enough, you'll wake up one morning and realize you're the one who's become the ghost, the echo, the fading memory of who you used to be while something else walks around wearing your lifelike clothes, is still learning how to fit into properly. You ever wonder what it feels like when reality starts coming apart at the seams? Not all at once, not some dramatic collapse, but slow and subtle, like a building that's been sliding down a mountain for almost 100 years, and nobody can quite agree on when it started or when it'll stop. That's what happened to me in Jerome's old jail, and I need you to understand that I went in there as a professional. I've been investigating paranormal claims for 8 years, running a podcast that breaks down supposedly haunted locations using actual scientific equipment. EMF meters, thermal cameras, the works. I don't do seances or Ouija boards or any of that performance art garbage. I document measurable phenomena and try to find explanations that don't require believing in ghosts. The Jerome jail seemed perfect for an episode because the building's movement is documented fact. In 1928, mining subsidence caused the entire structure to slide 225 feet down Cleopatra Hill. It's still moving, couple inches every year. Perfect opportunity to talk about how geological instability creates sounds and sensations people interpret as haunting. Except that's not what the building was doing. The building was moving in ways that had nothing to do with geology. I got permission from the Jerome Historical Society to spend a night in the jail on a Wednesday in September. They gave me the key and told me the usual warnings about the uneven floors and the structural instability, how the whole building tilted at an angle that made you feel perpetually off balance. What they didn't mention, or maybe didn't know, was that the jail's relationship with time was just as unstable as its relationship with gravity. I arrived around 8 p.m. with my equipment cases, and the first thing you notice is that tilted floor. It's disorienting in a way that's hard to describe, like being drunk without any of the pleasant parts. Your inner ear constantly screaming that something's wrong. The jail itself is just 4 cells, old iron bars and stone walls, with windows that look out over the valley dropping away into darkness. I set up my equipment in the main holding area, cameras pointing at each cell, sensors monitoring temperature, and electromagnetic fields. Everything time-stamped and recording to multiple devices. Basic protocol. I even did a walkthrough recording for my podcast, explaining the building's history, the 1928 slide, the prisoners who'd been held here over the decades. Normal investigator stuff. Things started getting abnormal around 9:30. I was sitting on the floor reviewing my baseline readings when I noticed the graffiti on the walls was different. Not dramatically different, but wrong in subtle ways. There was a carved inscription near the second cell that read Holbrook, 1917, which I documented during my initial walkthrough. Except now it read Holbrook, 1923. I checked my footage from an hour earlier, and sure enough, it had said 1917. I assumed I'd misread it the first time, made a note, kept recording. Then the temperature dropped 15 degrees in about 30 seconds. That's not unusual in the old stone buildings in the mountains. But my instruments showed the temperature outside remained constant. The cold was internal, localized, and it brought with it a smell like tobacco and whiskey and unwashed bodies pressed together in small spaces. And I started hearing voices. Not dramatic voices, not theatrical ghost moaning, but conversation. Quiet, distant, like it was coming from the next room, except there was no next room. Men talking about shift changes and copper prices, and some woman named Delilah, who worked at a saloon that burned down in 1915. I recorded everything, documented the temperature anomaly, tried to locate the source of the sound. That's when I saw him. In the third cell, just for a second, there was a man sitting on the bench, broad-brimmed hat, dirty canvas jacket, hands covered in calluses and copper dust. He looked directly at me, seemed confused, and then he wasn't there anymore. My cameras captured nothing. My recording equipment picked up the voices, but showed no visual anomaly. I was trying to process this, trying to figure out if I'd hallucinated from the disorienting floor tilt when the building shifted. Not a small movement, not the imperceptible creep of geological subsidence. The entire structure lurched like someone had grabbed it and yanked it sideways. I was thrown against the wall, equipment cases sliding across the tilted floor, and for about 5 seconds, everything was chaos and grinding stone. Then it stopped. I got my bearings, checked that nothing was broken, and looked out the window. The view was wrong. The valley was still there. The lights of the modern buildings were still visible, but there were other lights too. Scattered up the hillside where I knew there were only ruins, concentrated downtown where there should only be art galleries and wine bars, the warm glow of oil lamps and electric bulbs from an era when electricity was still a luxury. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising given we were in the mountains. But the time was wrong. My phone said it was 9:45 p.m., exactly the same time it had been when the building shifted. The clock hadn't moved forward. It had stopped, or maybe it was moving in a different direction than it should. I went to the door, tried my key. The lock wouldn't turn, not because it was stuck, but because the mechanism was different. The modern deadbolt the Historical Society had installed was gone, replaced by an old iron lock that looked original to 1928. Through the small window in the door, I could see the street, and there were people out there. Not many, just a few walking past in clothes from another decade, and a Model T parked where a Toyota had been sitting when I arrived. I shouted. Nobody reacted. I pounded on the door, on the walls, and the sound seemed to get swallowed by the stone like the building was drinking it. That's when I understood what was happening. The jail hadn't just slid down the mountain in 1928. It had slid through something else, some crack in whatever keeps time moving in one direction. And every time it shifted, it was sliding between different moments, different versions of Jerome layered on top of each other like transparencies in a projector. The building shifted again around 10:15, or what my frozen phone claimed was 10:15. This time I was ready for it, braced myself against the wall, and felt the grinding lurch as reality reassembled itself around me. When I looked out the window, the view had changed again. Fewer lights now, more darkness, and what I could see of the buildings looked older, more ramshackle. The graffiti on the walls had changed too. Holbrook, 1917 again, along with dozens of other carvings that hadn't been there before, or had been but in different positions, different sizes. And there were prisoners in the cells. Not solid, not quite there, but visible enough. A drunk sleeping it off in cell 1. 2 men arguing in harsh whispers in cell 2. A woman in cell 4, which struck me as odd because I'd read that the jail rarely held women. But there she was, watching me with eyes that seemed more aware than the others. She spoke, and I could almost hear her voice under the general murmur of the building's collection of moments. She said something about the sliding, about how the jail was cursed to never stay in one time, how everyone who'd been held here was still here in some way, trapped in the building's endless falling. I tried my equipment. Cameras showed different things depending on which cell they were pointed at. Cell 1 showed empty stone. Cell 2 showed those 2 men, arguing about something in 1920. Cell 3 showed a body, someone who died in custody, the image flickering between being there and not being there. Cell 4 showed the woman, and behind her, visible through the bars, a view of Jerome that didn't match any era I recognized. Buildings in wrong positions, streets running at impossible angles, like multiple versions of the town were trying to exist in the same space. My audio recorders were picking up everything now, a cacophony of conversations from different decades, different languages, English and Spanish, and something that might have been Apache, all of them talking about the jail, about the sliding, about being stuck, and underneath it all, a grinding sound, constant and low, the sound of a building that never stopped moving, never found solid ground, never finished its fall down the mountain. The shifts started coming faster. Every 20 minutes, then every 15, then every 10. Each time, the view changed, the prisoners changed, the graffiti rearranged itself into new configurations. I was seeing Jerome in 1928, 1915, 1902, 1953, moments layered and shuffled like a deck of cards being constantly reshuffled. And I started seeing myself. In the corner of cell 3, in footage from cameras that had been recording for hours, I could see me sitting there. Not current me, but future me, or past me, or some other version of me who'd been stuck in this building during a different shift. And that version of me looked wrong, looked worn down, looked like he'd been here for years instead of hours. He was carving something into the wall, and when I crossed to that cell to look at what future me was carving, I saw my own name and today's date and the words "still sliding" underneath. I'm telling you this now because I need you to understand what's happening while I still remember it clearly, while I can still distinguish between my time and the building's time. The shifts are continuous now, happening every few minutes, and I'm losing track of which version of the jail I'm in, which era I'm experiencing. Sometimes there are other investigators here with me, people I don't recognize with equipment I've never seen, and they're all documenting the same thing, all trapped in their own moments of the building's endless movement. Sometimes I'm alone in a jail that's brand new, stone still fresh and clean. Sometimes I'm in a ruin that shouldn't exist yet. Walls crumbling, roof collapsed, nature reclaiming everything. The woman in cell 4 is always there, though, watching, and she's tried to tell me something important about the sliding, about how the jail isn't moving through space anymore. It's moving through everything, collecting every moment it's ever experienced, and forcing them to exist simultaneously. My phone is useless now, frozen at 9:45 p.m., the same time the first major shift happened. My equipment keeps recording, but I don't know what it's recording anymore, don't know which timeline the footage belongs to. I've tried the door during every shift, but it's never the right door. Never opens to my time. Always shows me some version of Jerome I can't reach. And I'm starting to forget things. Starting to lose memories of the outside, of the life I had before I came here, with my professional skepticism and my scientific equipment. The building is teaching me what it's like to exist in too many moments at once, to be sliding through time the way it's been sliding through space, never stopping, never stable, just falling forever through cracks in reality that mining companies opened when they hollowed out the mountain. The prisoners understand this. They've accepted it. They sit in their cells across decades and watch new people arrive. New investigators who think they can document and explain and eventually leave. But nobody leaves. The building is still sliding, and everyone who was ever here is still here. All of us existing in the same tilted space, the same impossible structure that refuses to stay in any single moment long enough to be real. If you're thinking about investigating the Jerome jail, if you're planning to spend a night there with your equipment and your rational explanations, I need you to reconsider, because the building doesn't just move anymore. It collects. Every moment, every prisoner, every investigator who thought they could document its mysteries. We're all still here, sliding together, and the shifts keep coming faster. And eventually you stop being able to tell which version of yourself is real and which ones are echoes from timelines you haven't lived yet or have already forgotten. The jail is still moving, still falling, and it's taking all of us with it into whatever exists when time stops being linear and starts being a pile of moments all happening at once in a building that can't remember how to stay still. I want to tell you about the 6 weeks I spent working in Jerome before I had to leave, before my hands started doing things I couldn't control, before I understood that some buildings remember the people who worked in them so completely that the memories become more real than the present. I'm a massage therapist, been practicing for 12 years, and I thought I'd found the perfect location when I signed the lease on that renovated building on Main Street. The rent was absurdly cheap for a space with that much character. Original wooden floors, exposed brick, these beautiful tall windows that let in afternoon light that made everything look golden and soft. The landlord mentioned it used to be a doctor's office back in the mining days. Said it with this casual tone like that was a selling point, like history added value. He didn't mention which doctor. He didn't mention what kind of medicine was practiced there. And I didn't think to ask because I was too excited about finally having my own practice in a town full of tourists who'd pay premium prices for spa services with a ghost town aesthetic. I opened in April, Spent 3 weeks getting the space ready, painting the walls this calming sage green, setting up my table, arranging crystals and essential oils and all the things clients expect from a wellness practice. I found some odd things during the renovation that I thought were charming at the time. Behind a section of drywall that had water damage, there was the original examination table, this heavy wooden thing with leather straps still attached, and stains that could have been iodine or could have been something worse. I should have had it removed, but it seemed like the kind of authentic detail that would photograph well for my website. So I had it cleaned and put it in the corner with a plant on top. There was a cabinet in the back room full of old medical instruments, scalpels and forceps and tools I couldn't identify, all of them rusted but somehow still sharp when I touched them, testing if they were safe to keep. I kept them too, arranged them on a shelf like decorative antiques. And there were papers, medical charts from the 1920s, documenting patient visits to Dr. Riley's office, Riley being the company doctor for the United Verde Mine. The charts were horrifying in their efficiency. Miner after miner, complaining of cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, and Dr. Riley declaring them fit for work, sending them back into shafts filled with silica dust and mercury vapor that were killing them by inches. My first client was a woman from Phoenix who'd come to Jerome for the weekend. Standard deep tissue massage, nothing unusual, except halfway through the session, I had this overwhelming urge to press harder, to find the places where her muscles attached to bone and assess their structural integrity, like I was checking if she could still perform labor. I pushed the thought away, finished the session professionally, and she left happy. But my hands felt strange afterwards, like they remembered doing something I hadn't actually done. The second client was worse. Middle-aged man with back pain from sitting at a desk, and while I was working on his shoulders, I found myself evaluating his lung capacity, wondering how long he could work in poorly ventilated conditions before the silicosis became debilitating. These weren't my thoughts. I don't think in those terms. I don't have medical training beyond basic massage therapy anatomy. But the thoughts kept coming, and my hands kept moving in ways I didn't quite direct, probing and measuring and assessing like they were performing an examination instead of a massage. By the end of the first week, I'd had 8 clients, and 5 of them mentioned something strange in their reviews. They said it felt like I had extra hands, like there were more than 2 hands working on them during the session. They meant it as a compliment, like I was so skilled it felt like multiple therapists. But I knew what they were describing because I'd started feeling it too. When I worked on someone, I could sense other hands moving with mine, slightly out of sync, pressing harder than I would press, finding painful spots I hadn't been trained to locate, and I was having dreams. Every night, the same dream of being Dr. Riley, of examining miners who were clearly dying, of marking them fit for work anyway because the mine demanded bodies, and the company paid me to provide those bodies regardless of their condition. I'd wake up with my hands cramped, like I'd been writing all night, and sometimes there'd be notes on my bedside table in handwriting that wasn't quite mine, medical observations about people I'd never met. The real problem started in week 3. A client came in complaining about shoulder pain from a hiking injury, and I started the session normally, working the trapezius and deltoid muscles, standard procedure. But then my hands moved on their own. I don't mean unconsciously. I mean I watched them move while my brain screamed at them to stop, watched them probe and press and manipulate in ways I'd never learned, and I couldn't make them stop. The client was face down on the table, so he couldn't see my face, couldn't see me crying and trying to regain control of my own hands while they performed what felt like a medical examination. They found something, a mass in his shoulder tissue, deep near the bone, that I should never have been able to detect through massage. My hands, Riley's hands, knew exactly where it was, exactly how large, exactly how long he had before it spread. And when the session ended and the client left saying he felt better than he had in months, I looked at my hands and they had marks on them. Not bruises, not cuts, but stains that looked like old blood, faded brown and permanent, that hadn't been there before. I started researching Dr. Riley, found records in the Jerome Historical Society, newspaper articles from the 20s, testimony from miners' families. Riley had been the company doctor from 1917 to 1931, and he'd sent hundreds of men back to work who should have been hospitalized, who were coughing up blood and couldn't breathe and were obviously dying. The mining company paid him bonuses for every man he declared fit for duty, and he'd gotten rich off their deaths. In 1931, a miner he'd examined the previous day collapsed in the shaft and died with a pickaxe in his hand, and that miner's brother came to Riley's office and beat him so badly that Riley never practiced medicine again. He left Jerome that same year and died in Phoenix in 1935, and the newspaper obituary mentioned his distinguished career serving the mining community, with barely a hint of the corruption and mass medical murder he'd facilitated. And his office, the space where he'd examined and condemned hundreds of men, was the exact building I'd just opened my practice in. I tried to stop, tried to close the practice, break the lease, get out before whatever was happening to me became permanent. But I couldn't make myself leave. Every morning, I'd wake up planning to pack my things, and by afternoon, I'd be at the office rearranging the furniture, polishing those old medical instruments, studying Dr. Riley's charts, and feeling this deep familiarity with his handwriting, his diagnostic patterns, his systematic approach to evaluating human bodies as economic resources. I was losing time too. Hours would disappear, and I'd come back to awareness standing over the examination table, Riley's examination table, with my hands moving through the motions of procedures I'd never learned. And clients kept booking appointments. My calendar filled up weeks in advance, even though I hadn't advertised, even though I'd stopped responding to emails and phone calls. They just kept coming, kept lying on my table, and my hands kept working on them with increasing confidence, increasing precision, finding things that shouldn't be findable, making assessments I had no business making. One night, I stayed late to review my client records, trying to understand what was happening, and I fell asleep at the desk. I dreamed I was Riley again, but this time the dream continued past where it usually ended. I dreamed about his last day in the office, about the miner's brother coming in with murder in his eyes, about Riley trying to explain that he was just following company policy, that individual lives didn't matter compared to the economic necessity of keeping the mine operational. I felt the beating, felt bones break, felt blood fill my mouth, and in the dream Riley was thinking that he deserved this, that he'd known all along what he was doing was wrong, that every man he'd sent back to die had left a mark on his hands that would never wash off. And when I woke up, my hands were covered in those same brown stains, and they hurt like they'd been broken and healed wrong. And I understood that Riley had never left this office. His guilt, his complicity, his hands that had touched and evaluated and condemned hundreds of men, all of it was still here, soaked into the wood and brick, waiting for someone else with healing hands to arrive so it could continue the work. I'm writing this from a hotel room in Prescott because I finally managed to leave, managed to break whatever connection was forming between me and Riley's memory. But my hands still aren't right. They move sometimes when I'm not paying attention, making those same probing, assessing motions. I'll wake up at night and find them hovering over my own body like they're examining me, like they're trying to determine if I'm fit for work or if I should be discarded. I can't practice massage therapy anymore. Can't trust my hands to do what I intend them to do instead of what Riley trained them to do 100 years ago. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel those other hands working with mine, can still sense Riley's presence, guiding my fingers to find the weak spots, the damaged places, the signs that someone's body's breaking down. Can still feel his satisfaction when my hands locate something wrong, something that in his era would have been a reason to declare someone unfit, but in his corrupted practice became just another problem to ignore in service of the company's needs. The building is still there on Main Street. Someone else will lease it eventually, maybe another wellness practice, Maybe someone who works with their hands and thinks the historic character adds value. And Riley will be waiting, patient and persistent, ready to teach those hands his diagnostic techniques, his systematic approach to evaluating human bodies, his complete moral surrender to economic pressure. The stains never wash off. I've tried everything, and my hands still carry those faded brown marks, still remember procedures I never learned, still want to examine and assess and determine who's fit for work and who should be condemned. Dr. Riley's office claimed hundreds of lives through medical corruption, but his hands never stopped working. They just waited in that building for someone new to wear them, someone who wouldn't realize until too late that some knowledge transfers through touch, that buildings remember the worst things that happened in them, and that guilt concentrated enough becomes its own kind of haunting, one that doesn't need ghosts when it can just borrow the hands of the living and force them to continue work that should have ended a century ago. There's a specific kind of violence that gets embedded in places where money was used as a weapon, where entire communities were kept poor and desperate by design. And I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened when I spent an afternoon in the ruins of Jerome's old company store. I'm a labor historian, spent the last decade researching exploitation in American mining towns, documenting how companies kept workers in perpetual debt through monopolistic practices. The company store system was particularly brutal. Miners were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company-owned stores where prices were inflated, ensuring workers could never save enough to leave. It was economic slavery with a thin legal veneer, and Jerome's United Verde Company perfected the system. I'd found references to a particularly egregious incident in 1917 involving a confrontation over falsified ledgers, and I wanted to see the actual location where it happened. The building's been abandoned since the 50s, mostly collapsed, but enough of the structure remains that you can still see the shelves, the counter, the place where transactions that destroyed lives were conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. I arrived on a Thursday in late September, that time of year when Jerome gets the good weather, cool mornings and warm afternoons, and that crystalline desert light that makes everything look more real than it should. The company store ruins are on the lower end of town, below the main tourist area. Just a shell of brick walls and rotted timber, with most of the roof gone. There's no official historical marker, no preservation effort, like the town would rather forget this particular piece of its history. I had my recording equipment and my camera, planning to document the space and maybe film a segment for the documentary I was working on. The interior was exactly what I expected. Debris everywhere, graffiti on the walls, shelves still standing but empty except for a few rusted cans with labels too faded to read. And there was the counter, massive oak thing that had somehow survived almost 70 years of abandonment, with the original cash register still sitting on top, brass tarnished black, but still intact. Behind the counter I found what I'd come for, the ledger. Huge leather-bound book, water-damaged and falling apart, but readable enough. Page after page of transactions, miners' names and purchases and running balances that never decreased, only grew. Flour at triple the market price. Tools that should have cost $2 listed at $7. Medical supplies, rent for company housing. All of it inflated, all of it designed to keep workers trapped. I was photographing pages, documenting the systematic theft, when I found the entry from August 15th, 1917. A miner had confronted the store manager about discrepancies in his account, claimed he'd paid off his balance twice over, but the ledger showed him still owing $40. There was a notation in different handwriting, just 4 words. Resolved through physical correction. I knew what that meant. I'd read enough witness statements, enough hospital records. The miner had been beaten, probably by company security, probably right here in this building. That's when the afternoon changed. I was standing there holding the ledger, reading that casual notation of violence, and I felt this surge of rage that wasn't entirely my own. It was too specific, too focused, connected to memories I didn't have of working underground for 16 hours and coming up to find your pay docked for equipment rental, of watching your children go hungry while the company store shelves were full of food you couldn't afford. I looked up from the ledger, and the store wasn't ruined anymore. The roof was intact. The shelves were stocked. Afternoon sunlight was streaming through windows that should have been broken for decades. And there was someone behind the counter, middle-aged man in a vest and shirt sleeves, mutton chop sideburns, weighing something on a scale that I knew from my research was designed to register light. Another way to cheat workers by underweighting their purchases. I tried to speak and couldn't. Tried to move, and my body wouldn't respond. I was watching, but I wasn't controlling anymore. I was experiencing a memory that wasn't mine, living through a moment that had happened over a century ago. The man behind the counter looked up at me, at whoever I was in this moment, and his expression was contemptuous, dismissive, the look of someone who held complete economic power over another person and enjoyed exercising it. I heard myself speak in a voice that wasn't mine, demanding to see the ledger, insisting the accounts were wrong. The store manager smiled and pulled out the same leather-bound book I'd been holding moments before, showed me a balance that I knew was fabricated, and told me if I didn't like the company's accounting practices, I was welcome to leave Jerome and find work elsewhere. Except, we both knew there was nowhere else, no other mines hiring, no way to leave without money, and no way to get money while trapped in the company's debt system. The confrontation escalated. I felt the miner whose memory I was trapped in lunge across the counter, grab the ledger, see the pages filled with false entries and systematic theft that had kept my family poor for years. The manager shouted for security, and two large men in company uniforms came through the back door, and what happened next was brutal and efficient. They didn't arrest me. They didn't call the local law. They just beat me systematically, professionally, the way you beat someone when you want to send a message to an entire community about what happens when you question the company's authority. I felt every impact, felt ribs crack, felt blood fill my mouth, felt the specific humiliation of being destroyed in front of other miners who'd come into the store and were now watching, learning what resistance cost. And through it all, the manager kept the ledger, kept the evidence of theft, kept the system running. Then I was back, standing in the ruins, holding the same ledger, but now it was rotted and falling apart again. The store was collapsed around me, and I was alone except for the echo of violence that seemed to hang in the air like dust. I checked my camera. It had kept recording through whatever had just happened, and the footage showed me standing motionless for exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds, not moving, barely breathing, just frozen in place, holding the ledger. But my audio recorder had captured something else. Voices. The confrontation I just experienced. The manager's dismissive tone. The miner's desperate anger. The sounds of the beating. All of it recorded clear as if it was happening in real time instead of being replayed from 1917. And my hands hurt. I looked down and my knuckles were bruised. There was blood on my shirt that hadn't been there before, and I could feel the specific ache of cracked ribs, even though I hadn't been touched by anything. I tried to leave, got maybe 10 feet toward the door before the loop pulled me back. Not physically, but temporally, like the moment I'd just experienced had gravity, and I was caught in its orbit. Suddenly, I was back behind the counter. The store was intact again, and the confrontation was starting over. The miner, me wearing his memory, was demanding to see the ledger. The manager was smiling that contemptuous smile. Security was coming through the door, except this time the beating was worse. They used a tool handle, broke my arm in addition to the ribs, and the manager made sure to show me the ledger afterwards, made sure I saw him add the cost of damages to company property to my account balance. The loop lasted longer this time, maybe 5 minutes, and when I snapped back to the present, I was on the floor of the ruins, gasping, My arm hanging wrong, even though x-rays later would show no fracture. Just phantom damage from injuries that had happened to someone else. The loops kept coming. Every few minutes, I'd get pulled back into August 15th, 1917, forced to experience the confrontation again, and each iteration was different. Sometimes the beating happened in the store. Sometimes they dragged the miner, dragged me, outside to make a public example. Sometimes other miners tried to intervene, and they got beaten too. And I felt their pain along with my own. Felt the accumulation of violence the company used to maintain its economic stranglehold. And each time I came back to the present, I was more damaged. My body was collecting injuries from events I hadn't physically experienced, and I was starting to lose track of which memories were mine and which belonged to the miner whose final confrontation I was trapped in. Because that's what I realized during the 7th or 8th loop. The miner hadn't survived. The beating on August 15th had been fatal, or fatal enough that he died later from internal injuries, and the company had buried him in an unmarked grave and erased him from their records like he'd never existed. I'm telling you this from a hospital bed in Cottonwood, because I eventually got out, eventually broke the loop, though I'm not entirely sure how. The doctors are confused by my injuries. Bruises that pattern suggest repeated trauma. Fractures that show on imaging but don't match any recent injury. Pain levels that don't correspond to any physical damage they can identify. I've tried to explain about the company store, about the temporal loop, about experiencing someone else's murder over and over. But they think it's a psychological break, trauma response to researching too much historical violence. Maybe they're right. Maybe I just stood in those ruins and had a dissociative episode that manifested as physical symptoms. But I don't think so. I think some acts of violence are so significant, so representative of systemic cruelty, that they leave permanent marks on the places where they occurred. And I think Jerome's company store is still playing out that confrontation, still beating that miner, still sending the message that resistance to economic exploitation will be met with physical destruction. The ledger is still there. I left it on the counter when I finally managed to crawl out of the building, and I'm not going back for it. Someone else will find it eventually, some other historian researching labor practices, and they'll stand in those ruins reading about systematic theft and casual violence, and the loop will catch them too. Because the confrontation isn't finished. The miner never got justice, never got his account balanced, never got acknowledgement that the company stole from him and then killed him for objecting. And until someone figures out how to resolve an injustice from 1917, until someone can give that miner what he died demanding, the company store will keep replaying that afternoon, keep pulling people into its memory, keep administering beatings for an offense that happened 108 years ago. My injuries are healing, slowly, but I still feel them sometimes. Still feel ribs that were broken in 1917. Still feel the specific pain of being beaten for having the audacity to demand fair treatment. The company store taught Jerome's miners that resistance was futile. And more than a century later, it's still teaching that lesson to anyone who comes looking for evidence of what really happened in those buildings where economic violence was just another business practice, documented in ledgers and resolved through physical correction. I need to be honest with you before I start. This story doesn't have a happy ending, and it doesn't have a satisfying resolution where everything makes sense and justice prevails. It's about the worst kind of horror, the kind that wears an innocent face and doesn't understand that what it's doing is wrong. It's about children who died violently and came back wrong, and about the choice I had to make when they wanted me to play their game. I'm a documentary filmmaker, been making historical pieces for about 8 years, mostly focused on industrial accidents and their impact on small communities. Jerome's powder magazine explosion in 1894 was on my list because it represented everything tragic about the mining era. dangerous materials stored too close to residential areas, inadequate safety protocols, children paying the price for adult negligence. 7 kids died when the magazine detonated, along with 2 adults and most of a city block. I wanted to film at the site, get footage of the crater that's still visible, interview locals about the historical memory of the tragedy. Standard documentary work. What I didn't expect was that the children never left. The Powder Magazine site is on the eastern edge of Jerome, where the town starts to dissolve into wilderness and old mining claims. There's not much to see. The explosion was so complete that it left mostly just a depression in the ground and some scattered foundation stones. Wildflowers grow there now in strange patterns, concentrated in rings that locals say mark where bodies were found, though I'm sure there's a more prosaic botanical explanation. The trees around the site have this odd quality too, growing at angles like they're leaning away from the crater, and nothing will grow in the center where the magazine itself stood. Just bare dirt that stays bare no matter what season it is, like the earth is still too traumatized to support life. I arrived around 2 p.m. on a Friday, good lighting for filming, and set up my camera to get establishing shots. The light was perfect, that golden afternoon glow, and the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just this heavy, expectant quiet that made my ears ring. I was filming a slow pan across the site when I heard laughter. Children's laughter, high and bright, and exactly the kind of sound you don't want to hear in a place where children died. I checked my camera, still recording, audio levels showing the laughter clearly, so I wasn't hallucinating. The sound was coming from the tree line, and when I looked, I could see them. 7 kids ranging from maybe 5 years old to 12, wearing clothes that weren't quite right for modern times. Dusty and old-fashioned, but not quite historically accurate either, like someone had dressed them based on a vague memory of how children looked in the 1890s. They were playing, running between the trees, and when they saw me watching, they stopped and stared, not hostile, just curious the way children look at unfamiliar adults trying to decide if you're interesting or threatening or just boring. The oldest one, a girl with braids that looked like they'd been tied 100 years ago and never redone, stepped forward and asked if I wanted to play hide and seek. Her voice was perfectly normal, cheerful even, and that was somehow worse than if she'd sounded ghostly or threatening. She sounded like a regular kid asking a regular question, and my brain couldn't reconcile that normalcy with the fact that I was standing in the crater from an explosion that had killed 7 children in 1894, and these kids were wearing clothes from that era, and I could see through them slightly when they moved into shadow. I did what any reasonable person would do. I said no thank you. I was just filming for a documentary. I'd be leaving soon. The girl's face fell, disappointed, and she said they'd been waiting so long for someone to play with them, that the rules said they had to wait until someone agreed to play, and wouldn't I please just play one game? Just one round of hide and seek, and then they'd leave me alone. Every instinct I had was screaming to refuse, to pack up my equipment and leave immediately. But I'm also a documentary filmmaker, which means I'm cursed with curiosity and a need to document things even when I shouldn't. I told myself one round wouldn't hurt, that this was probably some psychological phenomenon, trauma echo, something I could film and analyze later. The girl clapped her hands with genuine delight and explained the rules. Standard hide and seek, but with one modification. If I found all 7 of them before sundown, I could leave. If I didn't, I had to stay and keep playing. Forever. She said that last word with perfect childish earnestness, like it was the most natural rule in the world, and all 7 children nodded in agreement. This was their game, played by their rules, and I'd just agreed to participate. They scattered into the forest surrounding the crater, and I heard counting start. Not from one child, but from all of them in unison, their voices echoing from different directions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, ready or not, here you come. Except I was supposed to be the seeker. They'd reversed the rules, made me the one being sought, and I realized too late that I'd misunderstood what kind of game we were playing. I ran. Not toward my car, because somehow I knew instinctively that trying to leave before the game ended would be worse than staying. I ran deeper into the forest, looking for places to hide, and I could hear them behind me. Not running, just walking steadily, giggling occasionally, calling out in sing-song voices that I couldn't hide forever, that they were very good at this game. They'd been playing it for 130 years. I found a hollow between two rocks and wedged myself in, tried to control my breathing, tried to think. The sun was lower than it should be. I'd started filming at 2 p.m. and we'd begun the game maybe 15 minutes later. But now the light looked like late afternoon, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. Time was moving wrong, accelerating, and I had maybe 2 hours before sundown instead of the 4 I should have had. I could hear the children searching, their footsteps in the leaves, their voices calling to each other about where they'd looked and where I might be hiding. They were methodical, organized, working as a team the way children who've played the same game together for over a century would naturally become. And I understood gradually that this wasn't really hide and seek. This was hunting, and I was what they were hunting, and the game had been designed from the start to be unwinnable. The oldest girl found me first. She appeared at the opening of my hiding spot without warning, no sound of approach, just suddenly there, looking down at me with those eyes that were too old for her face. She said I was very good at hiding, but not good enough, and now it was my turn to seek. She reached out her hand to help me up, and I made the mistake of taking it. Her hand was cold, not corpse cold, but cold like metal left in winter. And when I touched her, I saw the explosion. Felt it. Experienced it from her perspective. The powder magazine detonating without warning, the world turning to fire and force. The specific sensation of being torn apart by an explosion that powerful. And I felt the confusion, the inability to understand what had happened, the childish certainty that if she just played by the rules, if she just followed the game properly, she could somehow undo her death and go back to normal life. That's what the game was. These children were trying to play their way back to being alive, and they needed someone living to participate, someone who could serve as an anchor to the world they'd lost. The game continued for hours. I'd seek and they'd hide, or they'd seek and I'd hide, the rules changing arbitrarily because dead children don't maintain consistency the way living ones learn to. The sun dropped lower with impossible speed, and I knew I was losing. Knew that when darkness came, I'd be trapped here with them, playing their game forever. Another ghost trying desperately to pretend the explosion hadn't happened. I tried reasoning with them, explaining that they were dead, that the game couldn't bring them back, that they needed to move on. The girl just looked at me sadly and said they knew they were dead, but if they stopped playing, they'd have to remember the explosion properly, would have to experience those final moments over and over instead of pretending they were just playing hide and seek on an ordinary afternoon. The game was their escape from trauma so complete it had torn them out of linear time entirely. As the sun touched the horizon, turning the sky red and orange like the explosion replaying in reverse, I made a choice I'm still not sure was right. I told them I had to leave, that I had a family waiting for me, that I couldn't stay and play forever no matter how lonely they were. The girl's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw rage there, the kind of tantrum fury that children are capable of when they don't get what they desperately want. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. The forest went absolutely silent, and I could feel the explosion building again, sense that they were going to replay their death and drag me into it, make me understand what it felt like to be torn apart and then forced to pretend everything was fine. But I held my ground. I said no. I said I was sorry for what happened to them, but I wasn't going to be their toy, wasn't going to enable their denial by playing along with a game that only trapped them further in their trauma. The girl screamed. Not a ghost moan, but a real child's scream of grief and rage and abandonment. All 7 of them screamed, and the sound was so loud and so filled with genuine pain that I almost gave in, almost agreed to stay and play forever, because at least then they wouldn't be alone. But I ran instead. Ran toward my car while they chased me, their forms flickering between being children and being victims of an explosion, their bodies shifting between intact and destroyed, their voices alternating between playful and agonized. I reached my car, got the door open, got inside, and as I started the engine, I looked back and saw them standing at the edge of the crater. Just standing there, watching me leave, looking small and lost and heartbroken in a way that dead children shouldn't be capable of looking because they should be at peace, should have moved on, should be anywhere but trapped in an endless game at the sight of their death. I left. I drove away. I abandoned 7 children who'd been asking for the only thing they knew how to ask for, companionship in their endless game, someone to help them pretend they were still alive. The documentary was never finished. I have the footage, hours of it, showing children who shouldn't exist, playing a game with rules that don't make sense. And I can't bring myself to edit it or release it because I don't know what it means. I don't know if I did the right thing by leaving. Those children are still there, still playing their game, still waiting for someone to agree to one round of hide and seek that turns into forever. And sometimes, late at night, I hear them counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, ready or not. But I'm not ready. I'll never be ready, and they'll never stop seeking. I'm going to tell you something that saved my life, and I need you to hear me out even when it sounds impossible, even when it sounds like I'm describing a choice no rational person would make. 3 months ago, I drove to Jerome planning to die. I'm not looking for sympathy when I say that. It's just context. You need to understand what happened next, why I made the decisions I made, and why I'm still here talking to you instead of being another statistic in a town that's seen more than its share of death. I'd picked Jerome specifically because of the cliffs, because there are a dozen places around that town where you can step off solid ground and fall 1,000 feet into the Verde Valley. And I'd researched which spots were most reliable, which overlooks had the least chance of survival. The sliding jail overlook seemed perfect. Isolated, dramatic, with a straight drop onto rocks that would make everything quick and certain. I drove up from Phoenix on a Tuesday morning in July with no intention of driving back down. The overlook is exactly what it sounds like. A viewing area carved into the hillside near where the old jail sits, giving you this panoramic view of the entire Verde Valley stretching out below. On a clear day, you can see for 50 miles, all the way to the red rocks around Sedona, and the drop is so sheer that birds soaring below you look tiny. There's a low metal railing that's more decorative than protective, and beyond that just air and gravity, and a very final kind of certainty. I parked in the empty lot around 10 a.m., sat in my car for maybe 20 minutes working up the nerve, and then walked to the railing. The wind up there is constant coming up the cliff face, and it does this strange thing where it pushes and pulls simultaneously, like it can't decide whether it wants you to fall or wants to keep you safe. I stood there for a long time, looking down, and I was maybe 30 seconds from climbing over the railing when I felt the first death. That's the only way I can describe it. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but suddenly I was experiencing someone else's final moments. A man in the 1920s, drunk and despairing over a failed mining claim, stepping off this exact cliff, and I felt his last thoughts. The regret hit about halfway down, that terrible realization that he'd made a mistake, that he actually wanted to live, that the problems that had driven him here were solvable if he'd just had a little more time. But there was no time left, just 5 more seconds of falling, and the certain knowledge that he'd thrown away something precious and irreplaceable. then impact. And for a fraction of a second, I felt what it's like when a human body hits rock at terminal velocity. And then nothing. I was back on the overlook, gasping, my hands gripping the railing so hard my knuckles were white. Before I could process what had just happened, the second death hit me. A woman in the 40s, pushed by someone she'd trusted, experiencing pure betrayal and terror in her final moments. No philosophical regret, just animal panic and the desperate wish to survive, to get one more breath, to have just a few more seconds of existence, no matter how painful. I felt her hit the rocks, felt the specific sensation of consciousness ending mid-thought, the worst kind of interruption. Then I was back again, and another death was already starting. A teenager in the 60s who'd taken a dare, who'd been showing off for friends, and lost his footing, whose last thought was embarrassment more than fear because he couldn't believe something so stupid was going to kill him. Each death lasted only as long as the fall, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, but they were the most vivid, most complete experiences I'd ever had. I wasn't watching these deaths. I was living them, feeling every emotion, every physical sensation, every final desperate thought. They kept coming. A miner who'd jumped in 1903, a tourist who'd leaned too far over in 1978, a woman who'd been murdered and thrown from the cliff in 1931, a drunk who'd stumbled in the dark, a child who'd wandered away from parents and fallen accidentally, suicide and murder and accident and drunken mistake, dozens of deaths spanning over a century, all of them happening to me simultaneously, all of them showing me with absolute clarity what those final seconds felt like. And almost all of them shared one thing: regret. The certainty in those last moments that dying was a mistake, that life was worth living despite the pain, that they wanted more time, wanted another chance, wanted to take back the choice or the misstep that had led them here. I stood at that railing living through death after death, and each one made me less certain about my own decision, made me question whether I really wanted this or if I was just in too much pain to see any other option. After maybe the 20th death, I lost count. They were coming so fast. I managed to step back from the railing. My legs were shaking, my heart was racing, and I had this overwhelming certainty that I needed to leave, needed to get away from the cliff and reconsider everything. But when I turned toward my car, I couldn't move. Not physically paralyzed, but there was this pressure, this force that felt like hands on my shoulders, gently but firmly turning me back toward the drop. And I heard a voice, not audible but clear, as if someone was speaking directly into my mind, asking if I was ready to contribute my death to the collection, asking if I understood that this place was hungry, that it had been feeding on desperation and finality for over a century, and that every death made it stronger, made it better at compelling more deaths, made it more capable of pulling people like me to this exact spot. I realized with creeping horror that my choice to die here hadn't been entirely my own. Yes, I'd been in pain. Yes, I'd been depressed. Yes, I'd made the rational decision to research and plan. But the specific choice of location, the certainty that this particular cliff was the right place, the feeling of being drawn to Jerome even though I'd never been here before, that hadn't come from me. The Overlook had called me the same way it had called dozens or hundreds of others, planting the suggestion so subtly that it felt like my own idea. And now that I was here, now that I was close to feeding it what it wanted, it wasn't going to let me leave with a different choice. The pressure on my shoulders increased, pushing me back toward the railing, and I could feel the cliff's anticipation, its hunger for one more death, one more set of final moments to add to its collection. I fought it, dug my heels into the ground, leaned back against the invisible pressure, and screamed at whatever was doing this that I'd changed my mind, that I wanted to live, that it couldn't have me. The pressure increased until I thought my spine would snap, and the death started again. except now they were being forced on me all at once, dozens of final moments overlapping, creating this horrific symphony of regret and terror and desperate wishes for more time. I experienced being 100 different people in their last seconds, felt 100 impacts, 100 consciousness endings, and through it all the voice kept asking if I was ready, if I was willing, if I would finally step over the railing and complete what I'd come here to do. And I understood that this was the choice. Give in to the pain that had brought me here and become another death in the collection, or fight through the worst psychological torture imaginable and somehow claim the will to live that I'd lost somewhere in the months of depression and isolation. I chose to live. Don't ask me how, because I can't fully explain it. Maybe it was experiencing all those deaths and seeing how much those people wanted one more chance. Maybe it was pure spite, refusing to give this predatory force what it wanted. Maybe it was just that somewhere deep down, underneath all the pain, there was still a part of me that thought life might be worth another attempt. Whatever the reason, I found strength I didn't know I had and pushed back against that pressure, took one step away from the railing, then another, then another. Each step was like moving through concrete, and the deaths kept flooding through me, kept showing me what I was choosing to avoid, kept trying to convince me that falling would be easier than fighting. But I kept moving, inch by inch, until I reached my car and got inside and locked the doors, like that would somehow protect me from something that operated on a psychological rather than physical level. The pressure released the moment I started the engine. Just vanished. Like whatever controlled the Overlook had accepted that it had lost this particular meal and was already moving on to find another. I drove away, hands shaking so badly I could barely control the wheel, and I didn't stop until I was back in Phoenix. I checked myself into a hospital that night, told them I'd been planning suicide, got the help I should have gotten months earlier. Been in therapy ever since, working through the depression, finding better coping mechanisms than driving to cliff edges. And I'm better now, genuinely better, though I still have nightmares about those deaths, about experiencing over and over what it feels like to have your life end and realize too late that you wanted it to continue. Here's the thing, though. I've been researching Jerome's suicide statistics, and they're unusually high for a town of its size. Not massively, not enough to attract statistical attention, but consistently elevated across decades. People traveling from other places to die at specific locations around the town, particularly at overlooks and cliff edges. And when I looked into the details, so many of them had no prior connection to Jerome, no reason to pick that specific location except for some inexplicable certainty that it was the right place. I think the Overlook, and maybe other spots around Jerome, have been doing this for a long time. I think they've been calling to people in pain, planting suggestions promising certainty and finality, while hiding the regret that comes in those last seconds. I think these places are predatory in a way we don't have language for, and I think I got incredibly lucky to be stubborn enough to fight back. If you're reading this and you're in pain, if you're thinking about ending things, I need you to understand something crucial. Those last seconds before death aren't peaceful. They're not a relief. Almost everyone who dies from falling or jumping spends those final moments desperately wishing they could take it back, desperately wanting more time, discovering too late that their problems were solvable and their life was worth fighting for. Don't trust the voice that tells you there's only one solution. Don't trust the certainty that feels like your own decision, but might be coming from somewhere else entirely. And definitely don't go to Jerome's Overlooks if you're feeling vulnerable, because something there is waiting, something that's very good at convincing people to feed it their final moments. I'm still here because I fought, when I should have been too weak to fight, because I experienced enough deaths to understand that I didn't want to add mine to the collection, because in the end, spite and stubbornness can save your life when nothing else can. The Overlook is still there, still calling to people, still collecting final moments. But it didn't get mine. And if you're hearing this, if you're struggling, please don't let it get yours either. Let me tell you about the inheritance nobody in my family wanted. About the night I spent serving drinks to customers who'd been dead for almost 100 years. And about the rules of hospitality that apparently transcend death itself. Last April, I got a call from a lawyer in Jerome telling me my great-grandfather had left me his property in his will. I didn't even know I had a great-grandfather connected to Jerome. My family tree has more gaps than branches. Lots of people who left and never talked about where they came from. Turns out my great-grandfather owned a saloon on Main Street that had been shuttered since 1928. And for some reason, he'd specified in his will that it had to pass to a direct descendant. Couldn't be sold to anyone outside the family. The lawyer said the building had been sitting empty for 97 years, taxes paid from a trust fund, just waiting for someone to claim it. I was broke, working 3 jobs to cover rent in Flagstaff. So the idea of owning property, even abandoned property, seemed like a gift. I drove down to Jerome the next weekend to see what I'd inherited. The saloon was exactly what you'd expect from a building that hadn't been touched since the 20s. Boarded windows, layers of dust, the smell of old wood and stale beer and time. But underneath the decay, you could see it had been beautiful once. A mahogany bar that ran the entire length of the room, brass fixtures that had tarnished black, Art Deco mirrors behind the bar that somehow hadn't been broken or stolen. There was even glassware still on the shelves, bottles of whiskey with labels I didn't recognize, and in the back room I found a speakeasy entrance, a hidden door behind a false wall that led to a basement where the real drinking had happened during Prohibition. The whole place felt frozen, like everyone had just walked out one night and never come back. The lawyer had mentioned that in passing, actually. On September 14th, 1928, federal prohibition agents raided the saloon, but when they broke down the door, the place was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of evidence. No liquor, no customers, no staff. Just an ordinary closed bar. But witnesses had seen dozens of people enter that night, had heard music and laughter, and nobody had seen anyone leave. It became a local mystery, one of those small-town legends that gets passed down but never solved. I spent the first day cleaning, trying to decide if the building was salvageable or if I should just sell the land. But as I worked, I started feeling possessive about it, started imagining what it would be like to renovate and reopen, to bring the saloon back to life. I decided to spend one night there, sleep in the back room, and get a feel for the space before making any decisions. That was a mistake, but also maybe the only choice I could have made because the building had been waiting 97 years for family to come back, and it wasn't going to let me leave without fulfilling whatever obligation my great-grandfather had left unfinished. I locked the doors around 10 p.m., set up a sleeping bag in the back room, and tried to get comfortable. The building made the normal old building sounds, wood settling, wind through gaps in the boards, pipes that hadn't moved water in decades making mysterious creaking noises. I was almost asleep when I heard the music start. Not recorded music. Not a radio someone had left on. Live music. A jazz quartet playing something upbeat and cheerful from the main room. I sat up, heart pounding, and crept to the door. Through the gap, I could see the saloon, and it wasn't abandoned anymore. The lights were on, not electric lights, but oil lamps and early electric bulbs giving everything a warm, golden glow. The bar was clean and polished, bottles arranged neatly on the shelves, and there were people, dozens of them, dressed in 20s-era clothing, sitting at tables, standing at the bar, laughing and talking and drinking like it was the most natural thing in the world. And behind the bar, in the exact spot where my great-grandfather would have worked, there was nobody. The position was empty, waiting, and as I watched, one of the customers called out for service, calling for someone by a name I recognized from family stories, calling for my great-grandfather to pour another round. I should have stayed hidden. Should have waited for whatever this was to end, for the vision or hallucination or temporal anomaly to fade. But I didn't. I walked into the main room, and every person there turned to look at me, and their faces showed relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. The music stopped. One of the customers, an older woman in a beaded dress that probably cost a fortune in 1928, stood up and said they'd been waiting so long. Said they'd started to think nobody from the family would ever come back. Said they'd been here in this night for 97 years, and they desperately needed someone to tend bar so they could finally finish their drinks and leave. I asked what she meant, and she explained with the patience of someone who'd had a very long time to think about their situation. On September 14th, 1928, they'd all been here drinking when Prohibition agents surrounded the building. My great-grandfather had panicked, performed some ritual or spell or made some deal, she wasn't clear on the mechanics, to hide everyone, to keep them safe from arrest, and it had worked too well. He'd frozen this moment, trapped everyone in this single night, and then he'd left, walked out somehow and locked the door behind him, and never came back to release them. She said the rules were simple. This was a saloon, and hospitality demanded that the bartender serve until everyone had finished their drinks and was ready to leave. Until someone from the family came back and tended bar properly, closing out tabs and calling last call and following the rituals that end a night of drinking. They were stuck here, stuck in September 14th, 1928, reliving the same hours over and over, unable to finish their drinks or leave or move forward into whatever came next. They'd been waiting 97 years for someone with family blood to come back and complete the service my great-grandfather had started. And now I was here, and they were begging me to do it, to tend the bar for one night, to let them finally have their last call and go home to lives that had ended almost a century ago. I didn't believe them at first. Tried to find rational explanations, tried to convince myself this was stress or carbon monoxide or some elaborate prank. But the woman took my hand and led me to the window, made me look outside. The street was wrong, 1928 wrong, with Model Ts parked where modern cars should be, with buildings that had burned down decades ago still standing intact, with gas streetlights instead of electric. And when I checked my phone, it had no signal, and the date displayed as September 14th, 1928. I was trapped in the same frozen night they were, and the only way any of us were getting out was if I played my role, if I stood behind that bar and served drinks until everyone was ready to leave. The woman, she said her name was something I can't quite remember. Everything about that night has this dreamy quality that makes details slip away. Explained that I had until sunrise. If I could serve everyone, collect their tabs, and call last call properly before dawn, the night would end and we'd all be released. If I didn't, I'd be trapped here with them, and we'd reset at midnight and do it all again, forever. I stepped behind the bar, because what else could I do? The moment I took that position, muscle memory I didn't have kicked in. My hands knew how to pour whiskey, how to mix cocktails that hadn't been popular in 100 years, how to work the antique cash register that somehow contained money from 1928. Customers started ordering, and I served them. And the night developed its own rhythm. Pour drinks, make change, listen to conversations about people and events long since turned to dust, and slowly understand that everyone here knew they were dead, knew they were ghosts, but couldn't leave this moment until proper hospitality was observed. A man told me about the mine collapse he'd died in 6 months after this night. A young woman talked about the tuberculosis that would kill her in 1930. They were all already gone from the world, but they'd been unable to move on because my great-grandfather had frozen them here and then abandoned them. The night wore on, and I served drink after drink, and slowly the crowd thinned as people finished and left, walking out the door into whatever comes after. But some customers kept ordering, kept drinking, and I realized they didn't want to leave. Being trapped in this moment might be hell, but at least it was familiar. At least they were still themselves, still conscious, still having the semblance of life, even if it was just one night, on repeat. Leaving meant accepting death fully, meant moving into unknown territory, and some of them were too afraid to take that step. I understood then what my great-grandfather must have felt, the impossible responsibility of being someone's last connection to existence, of having to convince the dead that it was time to stop drinking and go home. Around 4 a.m., as the first hint of dawn started touching the sky outside, I had maybe 10 customers left, die-hard drinkers who'd been ordering steadily all night, who showed no signs of being ready to leave. And I knew if I didn't get them out before sunrise, we'd all be trapped here when the night reset. So I did what any good bartender does. I called last call, announced that the bar was closing, that I needed everyone to finish up and settle their tabs. Some people complied, drained their glasses, paid with coins that vanished when I touched them, and walked out into the growing light. But 3 people refused, sat at the bar nursing half-full glasses, insisting they weren't ready. They needed one more drink, just a few more minutes. And I had to make a choice, respect their wishes and be trapped with them, or violate hospitality and force them out. I chose hospitality, poured them one more round, the best drinks I could make, and sat with them while they drank. Listened to their stories, their fears about what came next, their desperate desire to stay in this moment even if it meant eternal repetition. And gradually I convinced them that whatever waited beyond that door was better than being frozen forever, that moving on was part of the deal of being human, that they'd been brave people in life, and they could be brave in death too. The last customer finally drained his glass just as the sun broke the horizon, and he walked out the door, and the saloon shuddered around me like something releasing a breath it had held for 97 years. I woke up in my sleeping bag in the back room, with sunlight streaming through the boarded windows. The saloon was abandoned again, dusty and decayed with no trace of the night I'd just experienced, except for one thing. Behind the bar, in the antique cash register, there was a note in handwriting I recognized from old family letters. My great-grandfather apologizing, explaining that he'd been too scared to come back, too guilty about trapping those people, but he'd hoped someday someone from the family would be brave enough to finish what he'd started. The building is mine now, truly mine, not haunted anymore. I'm renovating it, planning to open it as a bar again, and sometimes late at night when I'm working. I swear I can hear jazz music and the sound of satisfied customers who finally got their last call and went home. The night of September 14th, 1928 is over at last. 97 years, late but finally complete. And I tend bar now with the knowledge that hospitality matters, even to the dead, especially to the dead, and that sometimes family obligations transcend generations and require you to serve one impossible night of drinks to customers who've been waiting almost a century for someone to call last call and let them leave. You need to understand that guilt has mass. Not metaphorical weight, not psychological burden. Actual measurable mass that can be quantified and weighed if you have the right instruments. I learned this in Jerome's abandoned assay office, and I wish to God I hadn't, because some knowledge changes you in ways you can't undo, forces you to see your own life as a ledger of harm that demands balancing. I'm a geology student, was doing my thesis on Arizona copper deposits, and needed samples from Jerome's mining era for metallurgical analysis. The assay office seemed perfect. It's where miners brought their ore to be tested and valued, so there'd be samples. And the building had been abandoned since the 50s, so nobody would care if I took a few rocks. I broke in on a Wednesday afternoon in October, just standard academic trespassing. Nothing that prepared me for what I'd find, or what it would cost me to leave. The assay office is smaller than you'd think, just 2 rooms. A front office where miners would wait, and a back laboratory where the actual testing happened. The lab still had everything, equipment that looked antique and precious, precision scales, and balances from the 20s. chemical testing kits in glass bottles with labels warning about mercury and arsenic, and drawers full of ore samples labeled with dates and names and claims. It was a geology student's dream, untouched primary sources from the height of Jerome's mining operations. I started collecting samples methodically, photographing labels, documenting everything for my thesis. That's when I noticed the main assay scale, this beautiful precision balance that probably cost a fortune in its day, was still perfectly calibrated. I tested it with a standard weight I carry in my kit, and it measured exactly right, accurate to 1/100th of a gram, despite sitting unused for 70 years. Professional curiosity made me start weighing my ore samples on it instead of my digital scale, and that's when things got strange. The first sample, copper ore marked as from the United Verde Mine in 1923, registered a weight that was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but off by maybe 2 grams from what my digital scale showed. I figured the old scale wasn't as accurate as I'd thought, but then I weighed a second sample, and it was off by a different amount. And a third sample was off by a different amount again. The scale was giving inconsistent readings, which didn't make sense for a precision instrument that had tested perfectly with my standard weight. I was trying to figure out what was wrong when I touched one of the samples and got hit with a memory that wasn't mine. A miner named something I can't quite recall, bringing this ore in to be tested, hoping it would assay rich enough to mean a decent payout. Instead, the assayer had deliberately underweighed it, recorded a lower value, and the miner got paid a fraction of what his ore was worth. The company pocketed the difference. This happened every day to every miner for decades. I dropped the sample like it had burned me, and when I looked at the scale again, I understood what it was measuring. Not physical mass, but guilt. The weight difference wasn't about the ore at all. It was about the theft, the corruption, the systematic stealing that had happened in this room. Each sample carried the weight of fraud, and the scale was still detecting it 70 years later, still trying to balance accounts that had never been settled. I should have left then, should have recognized that some instruments measure things we're not meant to perceive. But I'm a scientist, and scientists don't walk away from inexplicable phenomena without investigating. So I started weighing more samples, documenting the weight discrepancies, and each time I touched an ore sample, I got another memory. Another instance of theft, another miner cheated, another family kept poor while the company profited. The memories weren't just visual, I felt them, experienced the betrayal and anger and helpless frustration of men who knew they were being robbed but had no power to stop it. Then I made the mistake of weighing something that wasn't ore. There was a logbook on the desk, and purely on impulse, I put it on the scale. The needle swung wildly, registering a weight far heavier than the book's actual mass. And when I touched it, I was flooded with guilt so intense it drove me to my knees. The assayer's guilt, accumulated entry by entry, fraud by fraud, carried in this book for decades until the weight of it became too much, and he, I saw this clearly, hanged himself in the back room in 1931. The guilt didn't die with him. It stayed in the book, in the samples, in the equipment, waiting to be measured and acknowledged. The scale wasn't broken. It was working perfectly, weighing the moral weight of objects instead of their physical mass, and everything in this room was heavy with unpaid debts and unconfessed crimes. I was still processing this when the scale started weighing me. I didn't put anything on it, didn't step on it, but I could feel it somehow evaluating me, measuring my guilt, finding every mistake and harm and thoughtless cruelty I'd ever committed, and assigning it mass. And then I started seeing them. Memories of my own actions, but from other people's perspectives. The friend I'd betrayed in high school, experiencing my lie from her point of view. The relationship I'd ended badly, feeling the hurt I'd caused. The homeless person I'd walked past without helping, experiencing their desperation and my casual indifference. Every careless word, every selfish choice, every moment where I'd prioritized my comfort over someone else's well-being. all of it displayed for me in vivid detail, all of it weighed and measured and found heavy with guilt I'd been carrying without acknowledging it. The scale showed me a number. My guilt weighed 17 pounds, 4 ounces. That's how much harm I'd done in my life, quantified and precise, and the scale demanded balance. I could see the equation clearly in my mind, understood somehow that this was the real function of the assay office, not to measure ore, but to measure the moral weight of everything that passed through Jerome, to maintain accounts that the living world had forgotten. And the balance was deeply off. The assayers had weighed down miners with false measurements, had stolen value, and added guilt with every fraudulent transaction. And the building was still trying to correct the imbalance, still searching for a way to make the accounts settle. I was just the first person in decades to come in contact with the instruments while they were still functioning, still attempting to fulfill their purpose. I tried to leave, got as far as the front office before I understood I couldn't. The building wouldn't let me go while the scale was unbalanced, while I carried 17 pounds of unpaid guilt and hadn't done anything to offset it. I went back to the lab and looked at the scale, at the ore samples, at the logbooks full of theft, and I understood what was being asked of me. Not payment, not punishment, but acknowledgement and correction. The scale wanted balance, and I was the only living person present to provide it. So I started going through the logbook systematically, documenting every fraudulent entry, every instance of theft. I photographed pages, created a spreadsheet on my laptop, calculated how much each miner had been cheated, and what restitution would look like adjusted for inflation. It was tedious, painstaking work, and as I did it, I could feel the building's tension easing slightly, feel the scale's desperate need for balance being partially satisfied by someone finally accounting for the corruption. But documentation wasn't enough. The scale kept measuring me, kept showing that 17 pounds of guilt, and I understood that I couldn't leave until I'd balanced my own accounts too. So I started making a list, every person I'd harmed, every debt I owed, every relationship I needed to repair. I wrote apology letters on my laptop that I'd send when I got out. I made commitments to donate money to causes that would help the kinds of people I'd ignored. I planned how I'd change my behavior, how I'd live more carefully, more thoughtfully, with awareness of the weight my actions carried. And gradually, as I made these commitments, the scale's reading decreased. 16 pounds, 15, 12. The guilt was still there, but the intention to balance it, the genuine commitment to make restitution, that apparently counted for something in the scale's accounting. I worked through the night, alternating between documenting the assay office fraud and planning how to address my own moral debts. And by dawn, the scale showed my guilt at 3 pounds, 2 ounces. Still heavy, still requiring work, but light enough apparently that the building would let me leave with the understanding that I'd follow through on my commitments. I packed my equipment, left the ore samples where I'd found them. I didn't want to carry anything that weighed more than its physical mass, and walked out into Jerome's early morning light, feeling exhausted and changed, and aware of weight in a way I'd never been before. The assay office is still there, still full of equipment that measures guilt instead of mass, still trying to balance accounts from a century of systematic theft. I did follow through on my commitments, sent the apologies, made the donations, changed how I interact with people. My thesis ended up being about the assay office fraud instead of ore composition. I published the documentation I'd gathered, and it led to a historical society investigation that resulted in some recognition of how miners had been cheated, some acknowledgement of the corruption even if actual restitution was impossible for people long dead. And I weigh things differently now, not just physically but morally, constantly aware that every action has mass, every choice adds weight to a ledger that eventually has to balance. The scale showed me something true about guilt. It accumulates, it has substance, and it doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It stays with you, weighing you down until you do the work to balance the accounts. I'm lighter now than I was that night in the assay office, but I'll never be weightless. None of us are. We all carry the mass of our choices, and the only question is whether we acknowledge that weight and work to balance it, or pretend it doesn't exist while it slowly crushes us under burdens we refuse to measure. I want to talk to you about sound, about how certain frequencies can carry meaning that goes beyond what your ears process, and about what happens when you record something that should have stopped making noise 72 years ago. I'm a sound engineer, work freelance, mostly doing audio for video games and films, always hunting for unique ambient recordings that haven't been used to death. Jerome seemed perfect for this. Abandoned mining town full of interesting acoustic spaces, industrial sounds, wind through empty buildings, all that textural stuff that game developers pay good money for. I showed up in November with my recording equipment, planning to spend a week capturing the town's sonic landscape. The mine whistle wasn't on my list initially. I didn't even know it existed until I heard it blow at 3 a.m. on my second night there, a sound so loud and mournful it woke me from deep sleep and sent me scrambling for my equipment before I was even fully conscious. The whistle is mounted on what's left of the old administration building on the edge of where the mine complex used to be. Massive steam-powered thing, the kind they use to signal shift changes, emergencies, the end of the working day. According to the historical information I found later, it hadn't blown since 1953 when the mines closed for good. 72 years of silence. But I heard it that night, clear as anything. This deep bass tone that seemed to vibrate in your chest more than your ears, and underneath it, harmonics that felt wrong somehow, frequencies that shouldn't exist in a simple steam whistle. I got dressed and went out to investigate, recording equipment in hand, and I could feel the sound more than hear it by the time I got close. The whistle had stopped by then, but the air still felt like it was vibrating, and there was this smell, sulfur and copper, and something organic that I couldn't identify but that made my hindbrain scream warnings about danger and contamination. I set up my recording gear near the whistle tower and waited to see if it would blow again. Around 4 a.m. it did. The sound hit me like a physical force, and my equipment went haywire, levels spiking into the red, multiple frequencies registering simultaneously, and underneath the main tone, voices. Dozens or maybe hundreds of them, all overlapping, all saying the same thing in unison, though I couldn't make out the words. I recorded everything, standing there in the dark with this impossible sound washing over me, and I noticed the mountain was responding. Small vibrations in the ground, rocks shifting, the sound of movement deep underground, like something massive was waking up. When the whistle stopped, the mountain didn't. I could still feel vibrations, still hear distant sounds of activity coming from shafts that had been sealed and flooded decades ago. I went back to my rental and reviewed the recording, using my best headphones and audio software, isolating frequencies and amplifying the voices underneath the whistle's main tone. What I heard made my blood go cold. The voices were speaking English, and they were calling shift change, announcing that the night shift was ending and the day shift should report to the following levels, listing shaft numbers and tunnel designations, and the dates they were referencing were from last week. Not 1953, not some historical echo, current dates, as if the mines were still operational, as if there was still work happening in passages that had been abandoned before I was born. And underneath those announcements, I could hear tools, pickaxes striking rock, drilling equipment, the rumble of ore carts, all the sounds of active mining coming from tunnels that shouldn't have anyone or anything in them. I knew I should leave, should pack up my equipment and get out of Jerome before whatever was happening underground decided to notice me. But I'm a sound engineer, and what I'd recorded was impossible and therefore irresistible. I spent the next day researching the mines, learning about the layout, the history, The fact that United Verde Mine had reached depths of nearly 5,000 feet before they stopped digging, and that the deepest shafts had been sealed in a hurry in 1952, a full year before the official closure, for reasons that were never properly documented. There were rumors, persistent stories about the deepest crew breaking through into something they shouldn't have found, about men coming up from that final shift, changed somehow, about the company sealing the shaft with concrete and ordering everyone to forget what had been discovered down there. I thought they were just stories until the whistle blew again that night, and I recorded what happened next. This time I'd set up multiple recording stations around the old mine complex, trying to triangulate where the underground sounds were coming from. The whistle blew at 3 a.m. again, same mournful tone, same impossible harmonics, but this time when it stopped, I could hear the response clearly. Voices from underground, hundreds of them, acknowledging the shift change and reporting to positions. And then work sounds, sustained, organized, industrial-scale mining happening in shafts that physics said should be flooded and collapsed. My equipment was picking up the sound through solid rock, through hundreds of feet of earth, and the audio signature was wrong in ways I didn't have vocabulary to describe. The frequency patterns didn't match living humans working with metal tools. They matched something else, something that had learned to mimic mining sounds but didn't quite understand how they should actually sound, like watching a foreign film dubbed by people who don't speak the language. I made a decision that I'm still not sure was brave or stupid. I found an accessible mine entrance, one of the horizontal shafts that hadn't been sealed, and I went in with my recording equipment. Not deep, just far enough to get clearer audio to understand what was making these sounds. The tunnel was exactly what you'd expect. Rotted support timbers, standing water, graffiti from teenagers who'd explored before they got scared or smart. But the sounds I was recording weren't coming from this level. They were coming from below, from the deep shafts. And as I moved farther in, I could feel that vibration again, stronger now, and the smell was overwhelming. Copper and sulfur and something else. Something that smelled like ozone and organic decay and fear. My equipment kept picking up those voices, and I finally managed to isolate them enough to understand what they were saying. They weren't announcing shift changes anymore. They were reporting progress, talking about how the breakthrough was almost complete, how they'd almost reached the surface, how soon they'd be able to emerge from the restricted levels and access the upper shafts. That's when I understood what the company had sealed in 1952. Not a played-out vein or a flooded tunnel, but something the deep crew had broken through into, something that existed in the mountain before humans started digging, something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of access. The phantom mining sounds weren't echoes or ghosts. They were something using the tools and techniques it had learned from 70 years of abandoned equipment, something that had been digging steadily upward through sealed shafts and collapsed tunnels, something that the whistle had been calling to ever since someone or something had activated it after decades of silence. And the whistle wasn't signaling shift changes for human workers. It was coordinating whatever was down there, helping it organize its emergence, serving as a communication system for an intelligence that had learned mining from the equipment and bones left behind in the deepest shafts. I ran, got out of that tunnel as fast as I could, while my recording equipment captured sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, not anything with legs, but a slithering, rushing sound like rock itself was flowing upward through the shaft behind me. I made it out just as dawn broke, and in the morning light, I could see the ground around the mine entrances had changed. Subsidence, new cracks, places where the mountain had settled overnight as tunnels below collapsed or expanded or reconfigured themselves. And the whistle blew one more time, in full daylight, when steam whistles shouldn't be able to function at all because there's no steam pressure, no boiler, no mechanism to make them work. But it blew anyway, and this time I could hear the response clearly even without my equipment. From every sealed shaft, from every closed entrance, from the mountain itself, an answering sound that wasn't quite human, Wasn't quite animal, but definitely present and definitely aware. I left Jerome that morning, drove straight back to Phoenix, and I haven't been back. But I kept the recordings because I'm a professional, and you don't delete potentially valuable audio just because it terrifies you. I've been monitoring Jerome from a distance, watching news reports, following local social media, and there are signs if you know what to look for. Small earthquakes that don't match any fault lines. Reports of sounds from the old mine workings. Subsidence that's accelerating faster than the historical rate. Ground temperature anomalies suggesting massive heat sources deep underground. And 2 weeks ago, someone posted video of the mine whistle blowing at 3 a.m., which means it's still functioning, still calling, still coordinating whatever is down there. The mines didn't close in 1953 because the copper ran out. They closed because the deepest crew found something, broke through into somewhere that predated human mining by millennia, and the company's only option was to seal it and hope it stayed sealed. But seals don't last forever, and something down there has been learning, has been using 70 years of abandonment to understand the tunnels, to adapt itself to the empty spaces, to prepare for emergence. The whistle is calling the final shift change, and whatever worked those deepest levels before humans arrived is almost ready to reclaim them. If you found this story disturbing, if you want to hear more accounts of places where something ancient is waking up and the past refuses to stay buried, make sure you subscribe to Verified Souls. We document the encounters that official history tries to forget, the moments when the present collides with things that were never meant to surface. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Because Jerome's mines are still working, still producing, and what they're bringing to the surface isn't copper. And you deserve to know what's coming up from the deep before it arrives.